The Okanagan Valley is famous for its orchards, but we did not always have orchards dotting the landscape here. The Sioux people, the First Nations people of these lands, in traditional times they would harvest berries from low-lying bushes and roots and tubers that grow naturally here. The story of our orchards begins in 1826, all the way over in England. Captain Emilius Simpson was at a banquet in his honor. You see, the next day, he was setting sail for the New World. The lady next to him at that dinner, she playfully handed him the apple seeds from her dessert. And she said, "Captain Simpson, when you get to the New World, you should plant these." So Captain Simpson took the apple seeds, put them in the pocket of his jacket, and totally forgot about them. Months later, he was on the Pacific Northwest coast at a Hudson's Bay Company fort near Fort Vancouver. He put on that jacket, and what did he see? Apple seeds. He gave those apple seeds to the HBC gardener at that fort. His name was Bruce. Bruce planted the seeds in pots, put those pots high up in the windowsill, and lo and behold, they bore fruit. The first apples were small and bright green. Can you imagine what they might have tasted like? But everybody there wanted a taste. So they sliced them up as thin as they could, and everybody got to taste what might have been the first apples ever to grow in that part of the world. It took several decades for the first apple saplings to arrive in the Okanagan. They arrived with Father Pandozzi, a Catholic missionary who came up from Washington. And those first orchards here looked very different from orchards today. The trees on those early orchards were huge, and you needed a giant sky-high ladder to pick the fruit off of the top. The trees had to be planted far apart to allow them space to fully grow. And very typically seen on these early orchards were horses, and they had a really important job. You see, during harvest time, when all the fruit was picked, they would be put in bins on the horse-drawn wagon, and those horses would bring those bins of fruit to the packing houses. Now, we are inside the historic Laurel Packinghouse, and for years, horses like these would have lined up out the side of the building waiting for the fruit to be brought inside. Now, a couple years ago, the ramp at the side of the building was being redone, and the construction workers were digging up the ground. And they kept finding horses' teeth in the ground, where those horses would have lined up waiting for the fruit to be brought inside. In the early days, the women weren't allowed to work in the packing houses. It was considered men's work. When World War I broke out, almost all of the eligible men in Kelowna went overseas. And who was it that came in and filled those jobs? It was the women. And they earned a couple of nicknames. They sometimes were called the Apple Box Belles, and sometimes they were called the Apple Wrapper Flappers. Now, their job working on these packing lines was to wrap every single apple individually and perfectly pack them into the apple boxes. The women of the packing houses turned this into a highly skilled profession. Every single piece of fruit was perfectly wrapped, and every one was perfectly packed in a box. And a perfectly packed box, the apples would sit about an inch or so above the top. So when the lid was nailed shut, it would push them down just enough that they wouldn't rattle around and bruise, but not so much that the apples would get squished. Now, before getting a job in the packing house, you would have had to attend packing school. So I'm going to share with you part of a newspaper ad from the Orchard City Record, Kelowna's newspaper, in 1911. Packing schools to start at once. Mr. J. Gibb has been appointed by the Department of Agriculture as packing instructor for Kelowna and District, and has orders to start the classes as soon as possible. The course will consist of 12 lessons of 2.5 hours each, and a fee of $3 will be charged. There are still vacancies for several pupils, and early applications should be made to Mr. J. Gibb or to Mr. John Leithley. In 1937, Isabel Stillingfleet won an apple packing competition here in Kelowna, and she was then sent to Birmingham, England to participate in an international apple packing competition. She went to Birmingham and she easily won that competition, beating competitors from all across England and all the way from New Zealand. That win gave her the title the Apple Queen of the British Empire. She also won $100 and a 6-week trip around England. There was a bit of a catch. That 6-week trip wasn't just a vacation. She was promoting BC apples everywhere she went. Now, winning that competition, she packed 138 apples in less than 2.5 minutes. So that means about 1 apple a second sustained for 2.5 minutes. Now, if I want to take over the title of the Apple Queen of the British Empire, I'm going to have to pack an apple a second. I'm going to try it for 10 seconds and see how I go. I'm going to start my timer, and here we go. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I don't think I can give myself the title of the Apple Queen of the British Empire. I have 3.5 very poorly packed apples. Now here we have some trophies representing different competitions in Kelowna around the industry of agriculture and orcharding. And some of the trophies here are the Dessert Apple Championship of the British Empire from 1924, the Best Display of Poultry from 1922, and the Best Heavy Draft Mare and Foal from 1921. About 10 years ago, 2 very small, quite elderly ladies came inside the museum in the historic Laurel Packinghouse. And the museum staff that was there at the time went over to them and said hello and asked if they could help out. And those 2 ladies shared their story of friendship that began right here. You see, one of them, about 60 years earlier, had worked as an apple wrapper flapper inside the Laurel Packinghouse. And one day she did something that she wasn't supposed to do. She wrote a little note, she folded it up, and she tucked it inside of one of those apple boxes. And her note said, "I live in a place called Kelowna, British Columbia, and I'm wondering where this box of apples is going." A couple of months later, she received a letter in the mail from England. And that letter said, "I went to my local market, bought a box of apples, and I found your note." Those 2 ladies became pen pals, and for 60 years, they wrote letters back and forth. And they had never met in person until the lady from England flew here to Kelowna to meet her longtime pen pal, and they came into the museum and the Laurel Packinghouse to share their story. Now this picture here shows the staff of a packing house in the mid-1920s. And in this picture, I see the hard work that it took to work in the orcharding industry here. I also see the friendship and the camaraderie that came from working in the packing houses. And I wonder what other stories came from the Laurel Packing House through the years that these people worked so hard as the backbone of our orcharding industry.